Okay, let's go. Number 1. Ancient Jericho. You pull up satellite imagery of the West Bank, and for more than 2 decades, the oldest city on Earth wouldn't come into focus. Not a slow connection. The imagery was built that way, on purpose. Zoom into Tel Es Sultan, the mound holding Jericho, and instead of streets and rooftops, you'd get a smear of coarse pixels, like a satellite 20 years old would take. Except these satellites weren't old at all. What nobody in 1997 knew, a single clause in a defense bill was about to decide what this city looked like from space. In 1997, the United States Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act, and buried inside it was an amendment named for its 2 sponsors, Senators John Kyle and Jeff Bingaman. The Kyle-Bingaman Amendment did one specific thing. It barred American satellite imaging companies from selling or publishing pictures of Israel and the Palestinian territories any sharper than whatever the lowest resolution option on the open commercial market happened to be. Not a security clearance, not a classified zone. A law that pegged an entire region's public image quality to the worst camera anyone else on the open market was willing to sell. The stated reason was Israeli national security. Nobody in that room was thinking about archaeology when they wrote it. But archaeology is what actually got buried under the resolution cap, along with everything else sitting in the frame. 2 Oxford researchers, Michael Fradley and Andrea Zerbini, spent years documenting exactly what that law did to the historical record, and published their findings through the Palestine Exploration Fund. Their conclusion was blunt. Most archaeological sites across the occupied Palestinian territories simply weren't visible on the imagery the public could get. The Endangered Archaeology in the Middle East and North Africa Project, a research group known as IMANA, tracked the same pattern independently, site by site, tile by tile. Platforms like Google Earth, the exact tool anyone with a laptop can open right now, were showing the region as deliberately coarse, deliberately blurred, not a glitch in the data. A policy written directly into the pixels, and Jericho sat right in the middle of it. The oldest continuously inhabited city archaeology has ever confirmed, smudged into static by an act of Congress that had nothing to do with history and everything to do with a defense bill almost nobody outside a handful of policy researchers ever read. Jericho earned that oldest title the hard way. Excavations at Tel Es Sultan have turned up walls, a stone tower, and layers of continuous settlement stretching back roughly 11,000 years, through the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, right up through Roman occupation, and into the present day. No other confirmed city on the planet has that unbroken a resume. And for more than 2 decades, the clearest publicly available picture of it was worse than a picture of a much younger, much less significant town 2 counties over, simply because of which side of an amendment line it happened to sit on. Here's what that actually cost the people who study the region, not just curious viewers scrolling past. Remote sensing, reading a site from orbit instead of digging it, has become one of the core tools of modern Middle Eastern archaeology, especially in places too dangerous or too politically sensitive to walk. Cut the resolution, and you don't just lose a nicer picture. You lose the ability to spot a fresh looting pit, new construction creeping onto a protected tell, or the faint soil marks that give away a buried wall. That entire toolkit went dark over Jericho for more than 2 decades, by law. Here's the detail that makes this stranger than a simple cover story. The restriction was never really about hiding anything from people standing on the ground. Anyone in the West Bank could walk up and see Jericho fine. This was only ever about what the rest of the world got to see from orbit. For more than 2 decades, if you weren't standing there in person, the oldest city on Earth was, to you, a rumor with coordinates. That changed, partly, in June of 2020. Fradley and Zerbini kept pushing the case publicly, and NOAA, the U.S. agency that actually enforces the resolution cap, reviewed it. By then, non-American firms were already selling sharper commercial imagery of the region than the old American cap allowed, which made the original restriction pointless on its own terms. The cap moved. Roughly 16 inches per pixel became the new legal floor. Sharper pictures started reaching the public for the first time in more than 20 years. So is it still blurred right now, today, the exact second you're watching this? That part is genuinely hard to pin down. Google doesn't refresh every tile on Earth the moment a law changes, and a law easing a restriction isn't the same thing as every map provider immediately swapping in new pictures. What's not hard to pin down is the 23 years before that. 23 years, where one specific, named piece of legislation passed by two named senators, kept the world's oldest city smeared out of public view, and almost nobody watching the news in 1997 had any idea it had happened. Sit with that for a second. Somewhere in Washington, a defense bill got debated line by line, amendment by amendment, and one of those lines quietly decided that a Bronze Age tell in the Jordan Valley would spend the next 2 decades looking like a smudge of paint to anyone outside the region. What was buried there had nothing to do with it. A fight over resolution caps that had nothing to do with archaeology decided it instead. That's the pattern this whole list keeps circling back to. One law, one program, one custom, built for a completely different reason, ends up burying something nobody involved was even thinking about. Jericho is, if anything, a fairly restrained version of that pattern. What makes it worth leading with is that you can prove it with a citation and a court record, not a rumor. The next site on this list has nothing to do with a defense amendment. A live nuclear test range swallowed it instead, and the government that built the range never set out to bury a Silk Road kingdom. It just didn't know, or didn't care, that it already had. Number 2. Loulan, Lop Nur. You're standing at the edge of a dry lake bed in the Tarim Basin, in the far west of China, and there's nothing here but cracked earth and wind. It's hard to picture that this was once open water, but Lop Nur used to be a genuinely large lake, fed by the Tarim River, and for centuries a kingdom called Loulan sat right where that river met the lake, running caravans along the Silk Road from at least the 2nd century BC. Loulan mattered in its own right, a real stop on a real trade route, moving silk and goods between China and the West for hundreds of years. Then, sometime around the 4th century AD, the river shifted course, the lake dried up, and the kingdom that depended on both simply couldn't survive without them. The city was abandoned. The desert did the rest, burying streets and buildings under sand for over 1,000 years, until 20th century explorers started digging it back out, including the mummified remains of a woman archaeologists now call the Loulan Beauty, preserved so well by the dry desert air that her features are still visible today. That part of the story is tragic but ordinary. Rivers move, cities die. It happens across every desert on Earth, and archaeologists have documented dozens of Silk Road settlements that failed the same way, one river shift at a time. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. In the late 1950s, China chose this exact basin, Lop Nur, as the site for its primary nuclear weapons testing facility, its only one. Between 1964 and 1996, the government detonated 45 nuclear tests here, atmospheric and underground, some of them among the largest China ever conducted. And the ground they used for that testing sits right next to, and in places directly over, the ruins of Loulan. Nobody planned it that way. The Chinese government wasn't hunting for an ancient city to build a test site on top of. They were looking for empty desert, far from population centers, with room for a security perimeter measured in tens of miles. Lop Nur happened to already be empty, because a kingdom had died there 15 centuries earlier, and nothing had moved in to replace it. Two completely unrelated stories collided in the same patch of sand, one about a river drying up in the 300s, one about a Cold War weapons program in the 1960s, and now you can't fully separate either one from the other. Consider the scale of what got layered on top of a dead kingdom. A nuclear testing program means far more than a fence and a warning sign. It means a security perimeter, a network of monitoring stations, decades of restricted airspace, and a level of government secrecy that made the entire province functionally unmappable to outsiders for a generation. Loulan's ruins weren't just sitting in restricted territory. They were sitting in one of the most heavily monitored, least photographed patches of ground on the planet, at the exact moment satellite archaeology was becoming a real discipline everywhere else in the world. Explorers who first documented Loulan in the early 20th century, working for European and Japanese expeditions, racing each other across the Tarim Basin, had no way to know what the desert would eventually build next to their discovery. They mapped ruins, cataloged manuscripts written in a vanished local script, and moved on, decades before anyone in Beijing had picked Lop Nur for anything at all. The archaeology came first, the bomb came second, and once it did, the order stopped mattering to anyone deciding who got to visit. You'd expect someone to have said something. Nobody did. Not publicly, not for decades. The testing program was classified the way every nuclear program is classified, and the ruins sitting inside its perimeter were classified right along with it, as a side effect nobody had to write a policy for. Once the test stopped in 1996, the area didn't just open back up either. Loulan is now designated a national-level cultural relic protection zone, sitting inside what's officially called the Lop Nur Ecological Protection Area, and parts of it remain under direct military management to this day, not open to the public. Not open, in any meaningful sense, to outside researchers either, permits or no permits. Here's what that actually means for the ruins themselves. A Silk Road kingdom that vanished into the sand around the 4th century is now sealed inside a modern military and nuclear exclusion zone for reasons that have nothing to do with its history and everything to do with a weapons program that started roughly 1600 years after Loulan's last resident walked away. The mystery of why Loulan died, the river, the climate, the collapse of the trade routes that fed it, still isn't fully settled among archaeologists. It isn't going to get settled any faster with the site sitting behind a nuclear test range's fence line, radiation surveys instead of excavation permits. The Loulan beauty herself sits at the center of a separate argument entirely. Genetic testing on her and other Tarim Basin mummies has suggested ancestry links stretching toward populations far to the west, exactly the kind of finding that draws serious academic attention, and because of where her tomb sits, exactly the kind of finding that's hardest to follow up on with new fieldwork. You can study the mummy in a museum case. You can't easily go back and dig around where she was found. Up to this point on this list, the restriction has come from a government hiding something modern, a law protecting a nation's security, a testing program protecting its own secrecy. That's about to change. The next site on this list has nothing to do with anything a government built there recently. A decision people made thousands of years ago sealed it instead, and the thing keeping people out of it isn't radiation. It's live ammunition, fired across ground, that hasn't stopped being a burial site since the Bronze Age. Number 3. Salisbury Plain Barrow Field. You're walking across open farmland in Wiltshire, England, and up ahead there's a wire fence with a red flag on it, and beyond the fence the ground looks different, not fenced off like a construction site. Fenced off like nobody's touched it in a very long time. That's Salisbury Plain, and what's sitting under that untouched ground is one of the densest concentrations of prehistoric burial mounds anywhere in Britain, roughly 2,400 monuments in total, with 550 of them protected by law, most of them round barrows built somewhere between 2400 and 1500 BC. You'd expect a site like that to be a museum, or at least a marked trail with information boards. It isn't. The Ministry of Defense owns 150 square miles of Salisbury Plain, making it the largest military training area in the entire United Kingdom. And roughly 46 square miles of that, the core impact area, is used for live firing, where public access is either heavily restricted or shut off completely, permanently, no exceptions for a weekend hike. That's not a coincidence of bad luck for the archaeology. A detailed survey mapped thousands of individual sites inside the MOD's land, and instead of pulling the barrows out of military use, the plan built around them, foot traffic-only zones. Stone tracks laid down specifically to keep armored vehicles from driving straight over the mounds. And on the ground, individual barrows get marked with rings of small white posts, star-shaped markers, that tell tank crews and troops exactly where not to drive, not to dig, not to park a vehicle for the night. That kind of coordination isn't cheap or simple, and it isn't recent either. The relationship between the barrows and the military has been managed formally since well before satellite imagery existed to show anyone the results from orbit. It means the MOD employs its own archaeologists, full-time, whose job is to walk live-fire ranges between exercises, log new erosion damage, and flag any mound a tank route needs to be redrawn around. Picture that job for a second. A staff archaeologist standing near a blast radius, clipboard in hand, making sure a Bronze Age chieftain's grave doesn't get flattened by a Challenger tank on a training run. Nobody outside the MOD's own heritage office pictures that as a real job, and it's been a real job here since the 1990s. In practice, that means a tank commander checking a map before a live-fire exercise, cross-referencing the enemy targets against a second overlay entirely, one marking where the 4,000-year-old graves sit, so he can route the vehicle around them without anyone stopping the exercise to explain why. The barrows themselves aren't uniform little bumps in a field either. Round barrows sit alongside bull barrows, bell barrows, disc barrows, distinct construction styles built across roughly 1,000 years of continuous use as a burial landscape, long before anyone on the plain had heard of Rome, let alone a Ministry of Defense. Archaeologists who've been allowed limited survey access describe finding grave goods, pottery, and cremation deposits consistent with a community that returned to this same stretch of chalk downland generation after generation to bury its dead, exactly the kind of long-term pattern that gets destroyed almost everywhere else in Britain by centuries of plowing. If you're enjoying this, subscribe, because it only gets stranger from here. Here's the part that connects this site to the whole idea of Google Maps and blurred imagery. The most restricted section of the plain, the western part where live firing happens most often, has never been farmed, never been developed. No new roads, no modern buildings, nothing. Because of that, when you pull up satellite imagery of Salisbury Plain, that western stretch looks visibly different from the rest of the county around it. Blank in a way ordinary English farmland never is. Nobody blurred it on purpose. Decades of keeping the public out for safety reasons accidentally created one of the best preserved ancient landscapes in the country instead, and you can see the shape of that decision from orbit without anyone ever touching a pixel. The star ring markers are a warning sign that most visitors to England never even notice, because most visitors to England never get anywhere near this stretch of Wiltshire. Every one of those little white posts is doing double duty. Keep the tanks off the grave. Keep the grave a secret a little longer, just by being somewhere nobody's allowed to walk. Archaeologists who work with the MOD have described it as the strangest partnership in British heritage, a live fire range effectively running the best-funded, best-enforced protection program any prehistoric landscape in the country has ever had, and neither side set out to build it that way. Compare that to the barrows sitting just outside the fence line. On ordinary farmland the public can walk across freely. Plenty of those have been plowed down over the centuries to barely visible rises in the soil, or lost outright to modern agriculture. The mounds inside the restricted zone, the ones nobody's supposed to get near, are frequently the best preserved examples left in the entire country, not just the best preserved on Salisbury Plain. That's the strange thing about Salisbury Plain compared to almost everywhere else on this list. Nobody sat in an office and decided to hide these barrows. No law named after 2 senators, no nuclear program, just a live fire range that's been in continuous military use since the 1800s, and a side effect nobody planned for. The same danger keeping soldiers alert during training exercises has also been quietly protecting Bronze Age burial mounds from tourism, farming, and everything else that erodes a site over time. A government accidentally preserving history by making it too dangerous to visit feels, for a moment, like the strangest version of this idea the list has to offer. It isn't. The next site trades an accident of military policy for something far more deliberate. A live war zone, reachable only inside a convoy with an armed escort. Number 4. Dadivank Monastery. You're riding in a convoy of vehicles, and up ahead is a checkpoint manned by soldiers who aren't from either country whose territory you're crossing. This is the only way in. Twice a month, a convoy leaves Stepanakert, escorted by Russian peacekeepers, and if you're not on it, you're not getting to Dadivank Monastery, not as a tourist, not as a researcher, not even, for long stretches, as a priest. Dadivank sits in the Kalbajar district, in the mountainous region known as Nagorno-Karabakh, a piece of land that has been fought over for decades between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The monastery itself is old by any measure. Tradition traces its founding back to the 1st century AD, though the buildings still standing today, the ones with carved stone crosses and a bell tower that survived earthquakes and war both, mostly date to the 13th century, built during a period when the region's noble families were investing heavily in Armenian church architecture. That part of the story rarely makes the news, because for most of the monastery's history, it just sat there, quietly, doing what monasteries do. Then, in 2020, a war over Nagorno-Karabakh ended in a ceasefire, and the terms of that ceasefire handed the Kalbajar district, Dadivank included, back to Azerbaijani control. The 2020 war itself lasted only about 6 weeks, but it redrew the map of the entire region, and Dadivank ended up on the losing side of that redraw almost as an afterthought, a cultural footnote attached to a much larger territorial settlement negotiated mostly around gas pipelines, military positions, and refugee corridors. Nobody sat down specifically to decide the monastery's fate. It came bundled with everything else in the district. Overnight, A monastery that had been under Armenian-linked administration became a piece of contested cultural property inside a country it hadn't answered to in decades. Because the political situation was too unstable to leave the site unmonitored, Russian peacekeepers stepped in to manage access. That's the convoy. That's the checkpoint. That's why getting inside now means signing up for a scheduled trip run by a foreign army, instead of just driving up and knocking on the door. Dadivank's own architecture makes the stakes of that limbo easy to picture. The bell tower and main cathedral are carved with khachkars, memorial crosses unique to Armenian Christian art, each one individually cut with knotwork patterns that took skilled masons months to finish, and no two are quite the same. Earthquakes over the centuries cracked walls and toppled sections of the complex more than once. And each time, the monastery was repaired rather than abandoned, by communities who treated continuity as the whole point. You'd expect this kind of arrangement to be temporary, a stopgap until things settled down. It hasn't settled. The monastery's fate is still an open diplomatic argument, tracked closely by cultural heritage groups like Cultural Property News, and reported on repeatedly by RFE, RL. Armenian cultural organizations have raised alarms about the condition and future of Dadivank and dozens of sites like it, warning that inscriptions and khachkars, the carved stone crosses the monastery is known for, could be altered or reclassified once outside monitoring eases. Azerbaijani officials have made their own claims about the region's Armenian-era monuments and how they should be classified going forward. While all of that gets argued out in statements and negotiations, the actual stone building, the crosses, the bell tower, sits behind a checkpoint, more accessible to a peacekeeping force than to the people whose ancestors built it. That's the detail that actually matters here. A 13th century monastery, currently easier for a Russian soldier to walk into than for an Armenian pilgrim, and neither government has to explain that arrangement to anyone, because a ceasefire line, not a museum board, decides who gets past the checkpoint. Dadivank is also far from an isolated case. It's one of dozens of Armenian churches, monasteries, and cemeteries that changed hands in the same ceasefire. And heritage monitors have spent years since trying to track their condition from a distance, using satellite comparisons and whatever photographs occasional visitors are willing to share, cross-checking image against image, the way a detective would check an alibi, since a direct site visit usually isn't an option at all. That's its own quiet echo of the Jericho problem from earlier on this list. When the people controlling a site are also the only ones who get to say what condition it's in, outside verification becomes almost impossible. No defense amendment required. None of this happened because anyone wanted to erase Dadivank. Unlike a nuclear test site or a live fire range, there's no accidental preservation angle here, no side benefit to the restriction. This is just what active, unresolved conflict does to an ancient building. It doesn't get destroyed. It doesn't get restored either. It sits in a kind of legal and physical limbo, half protected, half abandoned, waiting for two governments to agree on something they've been unable to agree on for years. A war-torn monastery on a fought-over border, reachable only with an armed escort twice a month, on someone else's schedule. That's where active conflict leaves an ancient building. The next site on this list wasn't sealed off by a war, a nuclear program, or a live fire range at all. Nobody had to fight over it. A kingdom that ruled for 700 years collapsed entirely on its own, centuries ago, and the mystery of why it fell is now boxed in by a modern government permit system that has nothing to do with solving it. Number 5. Guge Kingdom ruins. You're standing in front of a wall of eroded clay towers in Zanda County, deep in western Tibet, and it takes a second to register that you're not looking at a natural rock formation. You're looking at the remains of a capital city. Wind-carved cliffs and crumbling fortress walls, blended together after centuries of weather, all that's left standing of a kingdom that ruled this stretch of the Himalayas for close to 700 years. The Guge Kingdom was founded around the 10th century, a Buddhist kingdom built in one of the most remote corners of the Tibetan plateau, and for 7 centuries it held together, developing its own distinctive religious art, its own political structure, trading and negotiating with neighbors across a landscape most outsiders never saw. Inside the caves and temple ruins that survive, murals still cover the walls in places, painted in a style that blends Indian, Nepalese, and Tibetan influence, the kind of cross-cultural artwork you'd expect from a kingdom that sat on a genuine crossroads. Then, sometime in the 17th century, it collapsed, fast, and nobody agrees on exactly why. Some historians point to a religious conflict inside the kingdom itself, tension between different Buddhist factions that spilled into open confrontation. Others point to outside forces, an invasion from a neighboring power that took advantage of internal weakness. There's no single account that's won out. Local legend adds a third layer on top of the academic debate, describing a final siege and a royal family that chose death over surrender rather than accept the terms offered by whoever was outside the walls. Historians treat that version carefully. Folklore hardens around real events but reshapes them too, and without more excavation, there's no reliable way to separate the parts that happened from the parts that got added later, generation after generation, to make the ending feel like it meant something. The kingdom that survived 700 years fell apart quickly enough that the people living through it apparently didn't leave behind a clear explanation. Or if they did, it hasn't surfaced yet. Buried somewhere in ruins nobody's been able to fully excavate. That mystery would be hard enough to solve under normal conditions. It's a lot harder to solve when the site itself sits inside one of the most restricted regions on the planet. Guge is in Gari Prefecture, hard against the Indian border, and getting there legally requires not one permit, but 3. A standard Tibet travel permit, an alien's travel permit for regions outside Lhasa, and, specifically because of how close Guge sits to that border, a military permit on top of both, issued only after a separate review that has nothing to do with archaeology and everything to do with troop movements on the other side of a mountain range. 3 separate layers of paperwork, just to stand in front of a wall. Compare that to a site like Hegra later on this list, where the barrier was cultural memory instead of a stamped document, or Salisbury Plain, where the barrier is a live fire range that predates the paperwork entirely, no signature required, just a red flag, and a live impact zone. Guge is the purest, bureaucratic version of the same idea. No danger, no taboo, no war. Just enough stacked permission requirements that access effectively narrows to almost nobody, one signature at a time. Getting all 3 approved usually means booking through a licensed Tibetan tour operator months in advance, since independent applications from individual foreign researchers are rarely processed quickly, if they're processed at all. That's not the kind of bureaucracy you get for an average archaeological site. That's the kind of bureaucracy you get for a strip of land a government considers strategically sensitive, and Guge happens to sit right inside it. Which means the people best positioned to actually study why this kingdom collapsed, foreign researchers with the specialized knowledge to interpret the ruins and cross-reference them against Tibetan and Nepalese chronicles, are also the people least likely to ever be granted the access to do it. Applications can take months. Some are simply never answered. Everything about Guge's fall was in place before the end came. Historians just don't know what everything was building toward. Was it a slow-burning religious split that finally cracked open? Was it a rival power watching and waiting for the right moment to strike? Every theory has some evidence behind it. A damaged wall here, a chronicle fragment there. None of them has enough to close the case, and the permit system makes it that much harder for anyone to gather more. That's what makes Guge different from almost everything else on this list so far. This isn't a law, or a nuclear range, or a live fire zone, or a war. This is a kingdom that vanished on its own terms, in its own century, and a modern border dispute that happens to sit right on top of the crime scene, keeping the investigation half-finished, centuries after the fact. Guge isn't the biggest forbidden zone on this list, not even close, but the reasons it stays half-solved and half-visited still matter, because the next site takes that same idea and pushes it further than any government or border dispute ever has. The next site has been legally off-limits for 800 years, on pain of death, and it's protecting the location of the single most consequential missing body in human history. Let me say one thing, and I won't bring it up again. All 50 places like this one are now one book, The Sealed Vault. Yours to keep, easy to gift, and the best way to support this channel. Links below. Let's get back to the video. Number 6. Ikh Khorig. You're part of a research team in 2013, standing at the edge of the Khentiyi Mountains in northern Mongolia, and you're not allowed to go any further on foot. What you can do is fly a satellite over it. Somewhere inside the mountains ahead of you, in a roughly 93 square mile stretch of forest and rock around a peak called Burkhan Khaldun, is the body of Genghis Khan. Nobody has ever found it. Nobody has ever been allowed to look hard enough to find it. Genghis Khan died in 1227, after building an empire that would eventually stretch across more territory than any single ruler in history has controlled before or since. Almost immediately after his death, something unusual happened. Not a public tomb, not a monument, a taboo. Ikh Khorig, the Great Taboo, was declared over the land around Burkhan Khaldun, and the rule was simple. Anyone who entered was to be killed. No exceptions, except for his own family, if they had another relative to bury there. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because that taboo didn't fade out after a generation or two, the way most ancient prohibitions do. It held. For nearly 700 years, a hereditary guardian tribe called the Darkhad enforced it, generation after generation, in exchange for being excused from taxes and military service. That exemption made the job worth passing down, father to son, a standing patrol with no salary except the freedom the empire granted them for keeping outsiders away. 7 centuries of a single family line standing watch over a mountain range because a Khan who died in 1227 was still, in a very real sense, being obeyed. Then in 1924, the old Mongolian monarchy gave way to the Mongolian People's Republic, and you'd expect that to be the moment the taboo finally lifted. It wasn't. The new Soviet-aligned government looked at the situation and made a different calculation. If ordinary people were allowed free access to the site associated with Genghis Khan, the thinking went, it would fuel exactly the kind of Mongolian nationalism the Soviets didn't want stirred up. So, they sealed it again, not as a religious taboo this time, as a highly restricted area, cordoning off roughly 3,800 square miles of land, all in the name of political control instead of ancient superstition. Sit with that for a second. 3 completely different governments, spanning 8 centuries, 3 completely different reasons, a death sentence, a guardian tribe's hereditary duty, then Soviet political anxiety, and every single one of them landed on the exact same conclusion. Keep people out of these mountains. A monarchy, an empire's death throes, and a communist state that officially rejected religion and superstition altogether still all arrived at identical policy, which is about as strong a signal as history offers that something in those mountains was always going to stay guarded, whatever flag happened to be flying over the capital that year. It's still working. The first real archaeological expedition into the area wasn't attempted until decades later, a joint Mongolian and Japanese team, and even then, ground excavation wasn't really the point, because you still can't just walk in and start digging. Mongolian archaeologists involved in later projects have described negotiating access almost site by site, balancing scientific interest against a cultural sensitivity that outlasted the actual guardian tribe's official duties by generations. Genghis Khan isn't a distant historical figure to most Mongolians. He's closer to a founding symbol of the nation itself, and that status alone does work that no fence or checkpoint could match. In 2013, a team from the Mongolian Academy of Sciences, UC San Diego, and National Geographic used satellite imaging instead, mapping what might be buried structures from orbit specifically because direct access to the ground remains restricted, politically sensitive, and in some ways, still, culturally forbidden. Local herders in the region still treat the mountain with a quiet deference all their own, long after any guardian tribe had an official duty to enforce it. Conquerors who reached anywhere near Genghis Khan's scale usually left behind a monument on purpose, a tomb built to be found and admired for centuries. His empire skipped that step entirely. There's no mausoleum standing guard over Burkhan Khaldun, no marker of any kind, nothing built to outlast him the way the pyramids or a Roman emperor's tomb were built to outlast theirs. Nobody ever built anything there to protect, which is exactly why nothing has ever been found. A conqueror who took cities by the hundred chose, in death, to leave behind nothing anyone could ever point to and confirm. This decision, sealing off an entire mountain range instead of just guarding a single grave, seemed extreme at the time it was made. It's the reason that, 800 years after his death, the resting place of the single most successful conqueror in recorded history has never been confirmed, by satellite, by permit-holding archaeologist, or by anyone chasing the legend with a shovel and no paperwork at all. Every other site on this list has been restricted for decades or centuries at most. This one has held for nearly 800 years, through 3 different political systems, 3 different justifications, and it has never once failed. Whatever is actually buried near Burkhan Khaldun, gold, weapons, the body itself, is still exactly where it was left in 1227, Because the one thing every regime that's controlled Mongolia since has agreed on is that nobody gets to go look. Genghis Khan's empire conquered by force. The next site on this list survived for over 1,000 years by convincing an entire religion never to set foot inside it at all. Number 7. Hegra, Mada in Sala. You're one of the first international tourists ever allowed to walk among the tombs at Hegra, and it's 2019. Carved facades rise straight out of the sandstone around you, tombs cut directly into the rock, and if this reminds you of Petra, that's not a coincidence. Hegra is Petra's twin, built by the same Nabatean civilization, and it's Saudi Arabia's first UNESCO World Heritage Site. The carving isn't the strange part. The strange part is that almost nobody outside Saudi Arabia has ever seen it in person, while Petra has been a global tourist destination for generations. The difference isn't distance. Hegra and Petra sit a few hundred miles apart, in the same desert, built by the same people, around the same era. Both cities show the same Nabatean engineering, the same carved facades cut straight into sandstone cliffs, the same water management systems that let a trading civilization thrive in a landscape most people would call uninhabitable. The difference is what this specific stretch of land is supposed to mean. In Islamic tradition, Hegra is identified as the land of the Thamud, a people described in the Quran as destroyed by God for their defiance and their idol worship, struck down by an earthquake and lightning. The Thamud themselves show up across pre-Islamic Arabian inscriptions too, not just religious text, which is part of why historians treat them as a real Iron Age people and not purely a symbolic or legendary one. It's not just a story people tell about the ruins. Hadith record the Prophet Muhammad personally instructing his followers, while passing through this exact region, not to linger there and not to drink from its wells. This was, according to the tradition, a land under judgment, and the instruction was to move through quickly and leave it alone. And no, this isn't an exaggeration for effect. That instruction has been taken seriously enough, by enough people, for long enough, that it functioned as a kind of religious quarantine on an entire archaeological site. No wall was needed, no checkpoint. Just 13 centuries of people choosing, generation after generation, not to go, and passing that choice down to their children as settled fact rather than superstition. Compare that to every other entry on this list so far. A defense amendment needed a Congress to pass it and a NOAA review to loosen it. A nuclear exclusion zone needs guards and fences and a classification stamp. A live fire range needs a Ministry of Defense, a training schedule, and a standing garrison. Hegra needed none of that machinery. It needed one instruction, attributed to one person, repeated honestly by ordinary families for 40 generations, and it outperformed governments with armies and budgets behind them. Jordan built an entire tourism economy around Petra, hotels, guided tours, an appearance in a Hollywood blockbuster, decades of magazine spreads, and generations of travelers who grew up assuming Petra was the only site of its kind left standing. While the world was busy turning Petra into one of the most photographed places on Earth, its twin city sat a few hundred miles away, doing the opposite, staying almost completely unvisited by outsiders. Saudi Arabia didn't start issuing standard tourist visas until 2019. Before that, seeing Hegra in person meant you were already inside the country for some other reason: business, diplomacy, pilgrimage, and even then, access to the site itself was tightly limited. Layer on top of that, Saudi Arabia's long-standing general restrictions on aerial and satellite photography across its own territory. Restrictions that only started loosening in the past couple of decades. And you get a UNESCO World Heritage Site that spent most of its existence functionally invisible to the outside world. Not because of a government order sealing it shut, but because of a warning attributed to a prophet that people simply kept obeying. If you've made it this far, subscribe, because the next two sites on this list get even stranger than this one. Here's what that actually means for a place this significant. One of the best preserved ancient cities on Earth, carved facades that have survived over 2,000 years of desert weather, kept off nearly every itinerary not by a lock or a law, but by a cultural memory passed down for roughly 40 generations. That this was somewhere you weren't supposed to want to stay. No government agency enforced it, no border guard checked for it. Parents told children, and children grew up and told their own, and the story did all the work a fence usually does. A curse kept people away from Hegra for 13 centuries, and it worked better than most governments' actual restrictions have worked anywhere else on this list. No fence needed, no permit office. Just a story people kept telling, generation after generation, until an entire UNESCO World Heritage City sat there for 1,000 years, essentially waiting for permission nobody in power ever had to grant. The next site never needed a curse either, and for a much simpler reason: it's too far into the desert for almost anyone to reach at all. Number 8. Cave of Swimmers. You're Hungarian explorer Laszlo Almasi, and it's the early 1930s, deep in the Sahara, and you've just climbed into a sandstone cave in the middle of a plateau called Gilf Kebir, close to the Libyan border. On the walls, painted in ochre and red, are human figures, dozens of them. They're not walking, or hunting, or standing still, the way most ancient rock art depicts people. They're swimming. Arms outstretched, legs kicking, painted in poses that only make sense if the artist who made them had actually watched people swim. Keep that image in mind, because the art itself isn't the strangest part. What the art proves is, this is, today, one of the driest, most lifeless stretches of desert on the planet, the kind of place that can kill an unprepared traveler in under a day without water. Thousands of years ago, before the region became the Sahara as we know it, this area held lakes and rivers. People lived here. People swam here. Someone painted what they saw on the walls of a cave that would sit untouched for thousands of years afterward, until Almasi's expedition found it. The discovery later became famous well beyond archaeology circles, inspiring a pivotal setting in the film The English Patient, which won a stack of Academy Awards and introduced millions of people who'd never heard of Gilf Kebir to the idea that swimmers had once been painted onto a wall in the middle of the driest desert on Earth. Almost nobody who's seen that film has ever actually stood in front of the real cave, and there's a very specific reason for that. Gilf Kebir sits in one of the most legally layered patches of land in Egypt. It's inside a national park, established specifically to protect the plateau's fragile environment and its rock art. It's also close enough to the Libyan border to fall inside a militarily sensitive frontier zone, the kind of area that draws extra scrutiny regardless of what's sitting on top of it. And the paintings themselves carry a separate layer of protection under Egypt's antiquities laws, which means visiting isn't as simple as buying a plane ticket to Cairo and driving out into the desert. The Cave of Swimmers isn't even the only painted cave out there. Gilf Kebir and the surrounding plateau hold other rock art sites documented since Almasi's era: giraffes, cattle, and human figures painted across a span of thousands of years as the climate slowly dried out around the artists. Each additional site just adds another layer of protected ground to a permit process that was already 3 layers deep before anyone found the first cave. You need a permit for the park, you need clearance for the antiquities, and you need to arrange it all through a guided desert expedition. Because independent travel into this stretch of the Sahara isn't something the Egyptian government allows casually, permit or no permit. Fuel, water, and a satellite phone aren't optional either. Gilf Kebir is genuinely far from anything, hundreds of miles from the nearest town with a hospital, deep enough into the desert that a breakdown or a wrong turn isn't an inconvenience. It's an emergency with a very short clock on it. Almasi's team celebrated the discovery in the early 1930s, in the final stretch of an era when European expeditions could still wander large parts of the Sahara with little more than a permit slip and a compass. That era closed not long after, as borders hardened, and the desert filled in with the same layered restrictions that define almost every entry on this list. They had no idea how long it would take the rest of the world to be allowed back. Decades passed before serious follow-up research picked up again, and even now, most people who want to see the Cave of Swimmers in person are looking at a multi-day desert expedition with a specialized guide, not a weekend trip. Researchers who do make it out document the paintings under time pressure, because the same remoteness that protected the site for thousands of years also limits how long any expedition can safely stay. Here's what makes this one different from everything else on this list so far. Nobody is actively hiding Gilf Kebir. There's no law named after 2 senators, no nuclear program sitting on top of it, no war, no curse, no death sentence. It's just remote, layered under 3 separate kinds of paperwork, and that combination does almost as good a job of keeping a site invisible as any deliberate cover-up would. Which raises an uncomfortable question for everything else on this list. How much of what looks hidden really is deliberate? And how much of it is just distance and bureaucracy doing a government's job for it, without anyone ever having to write a policy that says, don't let people see this? There's no way to fully separate the two once they've been layered on top of each other for the better part of a century. Intent, an accident, end up producing the exact same result on a map. A blank space where a site used to be visible, and from the outside, you can't always tell which one you're looking at. Distance and permits kept Gilf Kebir out of reach, and the next site on this list needed neither. It needed only one thing, the single most heavily fortified border on the entire planet, sitting 5 miles away. Number 9. Kaesong and the royal tombs of the Goryeo dynasty. You're boarding a tour bus in North Korea, and this isn't optional. There is no other way to see Kaesong. No solo travel, no wandering off with a map, no independent research trips. You go where the state-approved guide takes you, on the schedule the state sets. And that's true whether you're a tourist, a journalist, or, in the rare cases it's allowed at all, a foreign archaeologist. Kaesong sits close enough to the South Korean border that, before the peninsula split in the 20th century, it was simply a Korean city like any other, its royal tombs studied and visited the same way any old capital's monuments would be. Division changed that overnight, folding a UNESCO-caliber site into whichever government happened to end up on its side of an armistice line drawn for entirely different reasons. Kaesong was the capital of the Goryeo dynasty for more than 400 years, from 918 to 1392, and its historic monuments were recognized by UNESCO in 2013. Scattered within about 12 miles of the city are the royal tombs, including the tomb of King Gongmin, burial mounds and stone statues, arranged according to Goryeo ideas about cosmology and the afterlife, sites that have survived war, occupation, and national division for over 6 centuries. The statues alone, stone civil officials and military guardians standing sentry along the approach to each mound, represent a scale of royal funerary architecture that most of the outside world has simply never had the chance to study up close, let alone photograph, measure, or compare against similar tomb complexes elsewhere in East Asia. Kaesong even briefly hosted a joint north-south industrial complex in the 2000s, one of the only places on the peninsula where citizens of both countries worked side by side, a project that opened and shut down more than once as relations between the two governments rose and fell. Even that arrangement never extended to the tombs themselves. And somehow, it gets worse, in the sense that this UNESCO-recognized dynasty's burial grounds sit 5 miles from the demilitarized zone, the most heavily fortified, most heavily mined border on the entire planet, separating North Korea from the South Korean territory it faced for most of its own history. Millions of landmines and thousands of artillery pieces sit within a short drive of tombs built for kings who died 7 centuries before either Korea existed as a divided state. Independent travel to Kaesong simply isn't permitted. Every foreign visitor goes through the state's guided tour system, seeing exactly what the government decides to show, on exactly the route the government decides to walk. And it's not just physical access that's controlled. North Korea maintains a blanket restriction on detailed public satellite and mapping coverage across its entire territory, tombs and capital cities included, the kind of restriction that makes it genuinely difficult, from outside the country, to get a clear, current, detailed look at almost anything on the ground. Researchers who study North Korean archaeology from abroad often work from decades-old survey photographs, and whatever a tightly chaperoned visit lets them see with their own eyes, nothing more. That combination, physical control plus mapping control plus a guided narrative on top, makes Kaesong different in kind from every other entry so far, not just in degree. Even the researchers who do get invited in describe the experience the same way. A fixed itinerary, a minder who never quite leaves the room, and no way to double back for a second look at anything that catches their eye the first time through. Jericho's blur came from a single amendment that outlived its own justification. North Korea's control has no expiration date built into it at all. It renews itself automatically, every single day, by design. In a few minutes, you'll understand exactly why this list ends where it does. But first, sit with what Kaesong actually represents among everything else here. Every other site so far has a story with an edge to it, a law passed and later relaxed, an accident of a live fire range, a curse, a taboo, the sheer distance of a desert plateau. Kaesong has none of that texture. This is simply a government, right now, in real time, deciding what a visitor is allowed to see, photograph, or even walk near, in a country where that kind of control extends to nearly every square foot of territory, ancient monuments included. These are the burial grounds of a dynasty that ended more than 600 years ago, sitting inside one of the only places on Earth where a single government controls, moment to moment, exactly what the outside world gets to know about them. What's buried there has almost nothing to do with it. Where the border happens to run explains the rest. 9 sites so far. A law, a nuclear test range, a live fire zone, a war, a vanished kingdom, an 800-year taboo, a curse, a desert wall of permits, and now a dictatorship's border policy. Different mechanisms, different centuries, different governments, and every single one of them landed on the same outcome, something ancient, kept out of clear view for reasons that almost never have anything to do with the thing itself. There's one more. It might be the strangest one yet, because it's the one you've almost certainly already seen, and the one where the ancient structure everyone's arguing about might not be a structure at all. Number 10. The Antarctica Pyramid. You're scrolling through satellite imagery of Antarctica in 2016, half paying attention, when something stops you. A mountain, rising out of the ice in the Ellsworth Mountains, and it's not shaped like a mountain is supposed to be shaped. 4 steep sides, straight edges. A peak that comes to a point the way a pyramid does, not the jagged, irregular way rock usually breaks. It's well over 4,000 feet tall, and from directly above, on a satellite image, it looks less like geology and more like architecture. Antarctica has a long history of producing exactly this kind of image. The continent is genuinely one of the least photographed landmasses on Earth at high resolution, mostly empty, mostly unreachable, and covered in ice formations that the human eye keeps misreading as ruins, walls, and doorways. This particular peak just happened to be sharp-edged enough and symmetrical enough from directly overhead to become the one that actually broke containment and reached a mainstream audience. It went viral almost immediately. And the story didn't stop at "this mountain looks like a pyramid." Believers went further, pointing to other patches on Google Maps of Antarctica that appear blurred out, smudged, or oddly low resolution, and treating those patches as proof of something. Not just a strange rock formation, a cover-up, a deliberately hidden, human-built structure, buried under Antarctic ice, that someone somewhere didn't want the public to find. That's not a fringe claim confined to one corner of the internet. Outlets that cover viral science stories, IFL Science and Live Science among them, have both written directly about how far and how fast this specific claim traveled. This is, by a wide margin, the single, most viewed, most repeated version of Google Maps is hiding an ancient structure that exists anywhere online. If you've spent any time at all in this corner of the internet, you've probably already seen a screenshot of this exact mountain with this exact claim attached to it. Here's what mainstream geology actually says happened. That shape is a nunatak, a peak of rock that pokes up through a surrounding ice sheet, and specifically a type called a horn, formed the same way the Matterhorn was formed, through hundreds of millions of years of freeze and thaw, eroding a mountain from multiple sides until it narrows into a point. Pyramid-shaped peaks aren't rare in mountain ranges around the world. They're a known, well-documented product of that specific kind of erosion, and this one just happens to sit somewhere remote enough and looks clean enough from directly overhead that it reads as artificial the first time you see it. Geologists who've studied the Ellsworth Range point to several other horn-shaped peaks nearby with the same 4-sided profile, none of which ever went viral, because none of them happened to catch the light in quite the same photograph. And the blurred patches believers point to as corroborating evidence turn out to have a much less exciting explanation too. Antarctica is enormous, sparsely imaged compared to almost anywhere else on Earth, and covered by weather that ruins a satellite pass more often than it cooperates. Low-resolution patches show up all over the continent, over empty ice sheets that have never had a rumor attached to them, for the simple reason that nobody has prioritized getting a sharper picture of empty ice. Treating ordinary imaging gaps as proof of a cover-up only works if you ignore how many of those same gaps sit over nothing at all. So which one is it? A buried structure someone doesn't want found? Or a rock formation that erosion carved into a shape our brains are primed to recognize as built? The honest answer is that the second explanation has actual geologists behind it, published, named, and checkable. And the first explanation has screenshots and speculation. That matters, especially on a list where every other claim has held up to exactly that kind of checking. Your brain evolved to find faces in clouds and shapes and scorch marks, because spotting a pattern fast kept people alive a lot more often than missing one did. That wiring doesn't know the difference between a real structure and a mountain that just happens to look like one. And that's exactly what makes this the right place to end the list. 9 of these places are real, documented, sourced, still standing right now exactly as described. This one, the most famous, the most shared, the one with the most views attached to it, is the one where the actual evidence falls apart the moment a geologist looks at it. 10 sites, 10 completely different reasons, and only one of them turned out to be nothing at all. The other 9 are still standing, exactly as described, real laws and real borders and real taboos keeping real ancient places just out of clear view, whether or not anyone was ever trying to hide them on purpose. Tell me where you're watching this from, and subscribe for more.